Knights believed their armor made them unbeatable, until they met warriors who proved them wrong. Here are 10 real moments when knights attacked the wrong opponent. Number 1. Robert the Bruce. When people talk about medieval duels, they often imagine two knights in shining armor meeting on an open field, like in a movie. But what happened on the first day of the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 was nothing like staged chivalry. It was a real moment, witnessed by two entire armies, and it became one of the most famous single combat incidents recorded in the chronicles of medieval Europe. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, was inspecting the front lines before the larger battle truly began. He wasn't sitting behind ranks of soldiers or hiding inside a command tent. Instead, he rode ahead on a small palfrey, not a warhorse, wearing relatively light armor and carrying only a battle axe. It wasn't unusual for Bruce. He led campaigns for years in rough terrain, fighting guerrilla-style battles against English garrisons and patrols, often ambushing or being ambushed. On the English side, Sir Henry de Bohun, a knight from a prestigious noble family, saw Bruce riding out in front. He immediately recognized him. Bruce had a distinctive crown-shaped crest on his helmet. For any knight, killing a king personally in battle was the kind of achievement that guaranteed glory, reward, and a permanent place in the stories of the time. De Bohun lowered his lance, pointed it straight at the Scottish king, and launched into a full-speed charge. A trained knight charging with a warhorse could generate enormous speed and impact. A direct hit from a lance could pierce armor or shatter bones. And de Bohun had the ideal conditions: open space, a clear target, and the element of surprise. What he didn't have was an understanding of the type of warrior Robert the Bruce truly was. Bruce watched the charging knight approach without panic. He didn't try to flee. He didn't raise a shield. Instead, he waited until the exact last moment. As de Bohun reached striking distance, Bruce slid his horse sideways just off the line of the lance. That tiny movement, perfectly timed, made the strike miss entirely. It was the kind of maneuver that requires precision, calm, and experience, the opposite of what de Bohun expected. Bruce then stood up in his stirrups and, with a two-handed movement, brought his axe down directly on de Bohun's helmet. Chroniclers like John Barber describe the blow as shattering both the helmet and the axe handle. De Bohun died instantly, falling from his horse in front of the entire English vanguard. What happened afterward mattered just as much as the duel itself. Bruce didn't celebrate or pose as a heroic king. According to Scottish sources, his biggest complaint was that he'd broken his favourite axe. But for his troops, this moment was electric. Seeing their king calmly win a duel against a fully armoured knight charging at full speed boosted their morale enormously, while the English side lost confidence in the opening moments of the battle. De Bohun had done what many knights of the period did: assume that status, armor, and momentum would overcome any opponent. Instead, he ran straight at a leader hardened by years of survival warfare, who knew how to make a single perfect strike when it mattered most. Number 2. William of Jülich. The Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302 is one of the clearest examples in medieval history of what happens when elite cavalry underestimates infantry. For generations, French knights dominated warfare in Western Europe. Their training, equipment, and social rank made them confident that no group of townsmen or foot soldiers could stand against them in a direct clash. At Kortrijk, this belief was shattered. The rebellion in Flanders had pushed France to intervene. The French crown expected a quick suppression of what they saw as unruly city militias. But Flanders wasn't just a collection of peasants. Its cities were wealthy, organized, and filled with guild members who trained together regularly. Leaders like William of Jülich, Guy of Namur, Peter de Koninck, and Jan Borloot created one of medieval Europe's most effective citizen armies. Their infantry wasn't random or improvised. They trained with long pikes and the Gordon Daga hybrid between a spear and a club with a steel spike. On top of that, they chose their battlefield carefully. The terrain near Kortrijk included marshy areas and ditches that made cavalry charges extremely risky. When the French knights charged, they expected the usual effect: infantry scattering, or breaking under the thunder of horses. But instead of a clean charge, their horses got bogged down. Mud grabbed at hooves, formations lost speed, and knights collided with each other, rather than with the enemy. Meanwhile, Flemish infantry held tight formation. When the French finally reached them, the knights didn't hit with the full weight of a shock charge. They arrived slow, off balance, and frustrated. That's when the Flemish struck. Pikes stopped horses. Godendags finished off dismounted knights. Hundreds of French nobles were killed, including Count Robert II of Artois. The Flemish collected so many Golden Spurs from the fallen that the battle took its famous name. This was the moment Western Europe realized that urban infantry, properly led and armed, could shatter the dominance of traditional knightly warfare. William of Jülich and his fellow commanders proved that discipline, coordination, and terrain could defeat elite cavalry in a head-on fight, something most medieval commanders thought impossible. Number 3. Werner Stauffacher. The Swiss Confederates of the early 14th century had no illusions about matching the Habsburg Knights in wealth or equipment. What they did have was a deep understanding of their mountain landscape and an infantry tradition based on pikes, halberds, and close-quarters fighting. Werner Stauffacher, one of the early leaders of the Swiss resistance, played a crucial role in the events leading to the Battle of Mogarten in 1315. When Duke Leopold I of Austria led a large knightly force to crush the Swiss, he believed sheer numbers and armor would guarantee victory. What he didn't realize was that the Swiss had been preparing for this confrontation for years. The Mogarten Pass was perfect for an ambush. On one side, steep slopes. On the other, Lake Egeria. Leopold's army walked straight into a narrow corridor where cavalry couldn't maneuver properly. Stauffacher and the Swiss waited above the pass, hidden and ready. As the Austrians advanced, the Swiss triggered the attack. First came the barrage. Boulders, logs, and stones rolling down the slope, breaking the formation and throwing horses into panic. Then came the charge. Swiss infantry, armed with halberds and pikes, flooded into the broken columns. Knights rely heavily on space and momentum. At Mogarten, they had neither. They were crushed against each other, trapped between a mountain and a lake, unable to swing their swords freely. The Swiss hacked, stabbed, and pushed them into complete collapse. Many fell into the water and drowned. Others were cut down where they stood. This victory wasn't a miracle. It was a direct result of using terrain, timing, and disciplined infantry to neutralize the advantages of heavy cavalry. Stauffacher and the Swiss Confederates showed that knowledge of the land could be just as deadly as armor and aristocratic training. Number 4. Arnold von Winkelried. Moving forward to 1386, the Habsburgs once again attempted to force the growing Swiss Confederacy back under their control. This time, at the Battle of Sempach, they brought a large force of knights and men-at-arms under Duke Leopold III. The Swiss infantry faced them in deep ranks, armed with pikes and halberds, weapons specifically designed to counter armored opponents. Unlike at Mogarten, this battle happened on more open ground. That meant the fight turned into a brutal, slow push between two masses of soldiers, with the Austrians trying to break into the Swiss formation. The legend of Arnold von Winkelried describes him rushing forward, grabbing enemy spears, and pulling them into himself to open a path. Medieval sources differ on whether this exact act happened, but what is historically confirmed is that the Swiss succeeded in breaking the Austrian front, and Leopold III was killed. The Swiss victory was not dependent on a single heroic act. It came from discipline, cohesion, and a deep understanding of how to resist armored shock troops. The Habsburg Knights fought bravely, but were trapped by their own armor, tightly packed, struggling for space on a slope during hot weather, conditions that led to fatigue and eventual disorganization. The defeat at Sempach cemented the Swiss reputation as feared infantry fighters. It also marked another major moment when elite knights underestimated the determination, training, and tactics of common soldiers, who fought with unity rather than noble privilege. Number 5. Edward the Black Prince. In 1356 at Poitiers, the French crown expected a decisive victory. King John II had assembled a massive army that dwarfed the Anglo-Gascon forces led by Edward, the Black Prince. French knights believed this would be a straightforward crushing of English raiders who'd been burning and pillaging their way across the countryside. But Edward was a strategist who understood something fundamental. Knights are strongest when they get to choose the terms of the fight, so he made sure they didn't. First, he chose a position shielded by hedges, vines, and natural barriers. This limited the space available for cavalry charges. Second, he placed longbowmen on the flanks where they could angle their shots into French formations as they advanced. Third, he had his men-at-arms fight on foot, making their line more stable and harder to break. When the French knights charged, they found themselves slowed by terrain, funneled into narrow approaches, and taking arrow fire before they could even reach the English line. Those who arrived were tired and disorganized. Then Edward launched a counterattack at the perfect moment, sending his infantry forward while mounted Gascon units hit the French from the sides and rear. The result was catastrophic for France. King John II was captured, thousands of nobles died, or were taken prisoner, and France fell into political and economic chaos for years afterward. The Black Prince didn't win with superior numbers or more prestigious knights. He won by making the French fight in a place where their greatest strength, the armored cavalry charge, was almost useless. Number 6. Henry V of England. By the time Henry V marched toward Agincourt in 1415, England's army was exhausted. The campaign in Normandy had been long and draining, and disease had taken a heavy toll. Many English soldiers were hungry, tired, and marching with worn-out equipment. On the other side stood the French host larger, fresher, packed with nobles ready to avenge earlier defeats in the 100 Years' War. But Henry V understood something essential about medieval warfare. Battles aren't decided only by numbers. They're decided by terrain, timing, weather, morale, and the ability to force the enemy to fight under conditions that benefit you. The ground near Agincourt was narrow-wooded on both sides, creating a funnel. Days of rain had turned the recently plowed field into heavy mud that clung to boots and horses alike. Henry's commanders, including Sir Thomas Erpingham, arranged thousands of English and Welsh longbowmen along the flanks. These archers had years of training. Drawing a longbow required enormous strength and discipline. Their rate of fire up to 10 arrows per minute could overwhelm units long before they reached melee range. Henry ordered sharpened wooden stakes, pavises, hammered into the ground, at angles facing outward. These were designed to stop cavalry charges cold. It meant that even if French knights reached the archers, they risked impaling their horses or getting trapped between rows of defensive spikes. When the French advanced, their cavalry didn't have room to maneuver. The soft mud made horses stumble, and the heavy armor of the knights became a burden rather than a protection. Arrows fell in dense waves, enough to disrupt the formation and kill mounts. A knight dismounted in thick mud was almost immobilized. The French vanguard eventually reached the English line, but by then the soldiers were exhausted. They were packed so tightly that some chronicles describe them barely able to lift their arms. Meanwhile, English longbowmen, after firing most of their arrows, ran forward with mallets, small axes, and swords. They were unarmored or lightly armored, which gave them better mobility in mud. Henry V didn't rely on a single tactic. He relied on a combination: the funnel-like terrain, the defensive stakes, the discipline of longbowmen, and the exhaustion he forced onto the enemy before they ever reached him. Agincourt became one of the clearest examples of how a well-prepared commander can dismantle a numerically superior force simply by controlling the conditions of the battle. Number 7. Władysław the Sek, Jagiełło. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410, also known as Tannenberg, was one of the largest battles of medieval Europe. The Teutonic Order had built its reputation on disciplined, elite knightly warfare. Their castles, their cavalry, and their strict military tradition made them a dominant force across the Baltic region. Ulrich von Jungingen, the Grand Master of the Order, believed fully in the strength of his knights. When he faced the combined Polish-Lithuanian army under King Władysław II, Jagiełło, and Grand Duke Vytautas, He assumed the order's battlefield discipline would overpower a mixed coalition, but Jagiełło and Vytautas prepared a more flexible strategy. Lithuanians used fast-moving light cavalry, who charged, harassed, and sometimes feigned retreat tactics similar to steppe warriors. Poles brought heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry who could stand firm in direct combat. The diversity of their troops allowed them to adapt as conditions shifted. Early in the battle, Vytautas led the Lithuanian cavalry in repeated attacks that pressured the Teutonic flanks. Some Teutonic units advanced too aggressively, chasing retreating Lithuanians and losing cohesion. Meanwhile, Polish infantry held the center, absorbing the order's main cavalry charges. The terrain was uneven, the heat was intense, and the Teutonic knights became increasingly exhausted. Jagiełło remained calm and observant, conducting the battle from a hilltop, where he could see shifts across the entire field. At key moments, he deployed reserves to reinforce weak points or strike exhausted enemy units. This ability to maintain control throughout hours of fighting played a major role in the eventual Polish-Lithuanian victory. When Ulrich von Jungingen attempted a decisive attack at the head of an elite Teutonic formation, he found himself surrounded by fresh Polish units. He was killed in the fighting, and the order's lines collapsed. Grunwald was the moment Europe realized that disciplined heavy cavalry, even from an elite military order, could be outmaneuvered by a commander who combined flexibility, coordination, and the intelligent use of diverse troop types. Jagiełło didn't win through brute force. He won through timing, patience, and strategic awareness. Number 8. Duke Henry II the Pious. The Mongol invasions of Europe in the 1240s shocked medieval kingdoms that had grown accustomed to fighting each other, not a fast-moving empire stretching from China to the edge of Poland. European knights believed in the power of heavy armor and direct charges. Mongol armies used something entirely different: mobility, composite bows, coordinated feigned retreats, and a command system that thrived on battlefield flexibility. At the Battle of Legnica in 1241, Duke Henry II, the Pious of Silesia, gathered whatever forces he could: Polish knights, Moravian cavalry, Templar detachments, and local levies. He planned to halt the Mongols before they reached deeper into Central Europe. The Mongol force facing him was led by generals Baidar, Kadan, and Orda, all operating under the grand strategy designed by Subutai, one of history's most skilled military commanders. The Mongols began by probing the European lines with horse archers, staying out of range of melee troops while shooting volleys of arrows. When knights attempted to charge, the Mongols retreated deliberately, drawing them away from supporting infantry and into open ground. This was a classic feigned withdrawal, one of the most dangerous Mongol tactics. When parts of Henry's army pursued too far, Mongol heavy cavalry and spearmen wheeled around from hidden positions and struck the isolated units hard. Communication within the European army broke down, and the coalition forces fought as scattered groups rather than a unified whole. Henry II died during the fighting, and his army was effectively destroyed. But the significance of Legnica goes beyond the defeat. It demonstrated that European knights were not ready for an enemy who refused to stand still and fight in the proper way. The Mongols dictated the pace, the range, and the direction of the battle from beginning to end. Legnica became a lesson repeated in later centuries. Battlefield mobility and tactical deception can neutralize even the most heavily armored opponents. Number 9. Sultan Bayezid I. The late 14th century saw rising tensions between Western European knights and the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. In 1396, the Crusader army marching toward Nicopolis included knights from France, Burgundy, Hungary, and other European states. Many of them treated the campaign as a test of personal honor, almost a tournament with real weapons. Sultan Bayezid I, known for his speed in both diplomacy and war, approached the situation with a practical and strategic mindset. He established layered defensive lines along the slopes near Nicopolis and used his infantry and archers to absorb the initial shock of a knightly attack. The French knights insisted, against the advice of experienced commanders, on launching a full heavy cavalry assault as the opening move. They indeed managed to break through Bayezid's first line of irregular troops, But this initial success was exactly what the Ottomans had prepared for. Behind the front line waited archers and janissaries with better discipline, protected positions, and clear fields of fire. When the exhausted knights reached this second layer, the momentum of their charge was gone. Their horses were tired, and their formation was stretched out and disorganized. Meanwhile, Bayezid's hidden reserve cavalry, well rested and positioned on higher ground, swept around and attacked from the sides. This turned a bold charge into a trap. European knights, stuck in enemy territory with no space to retreat and no reinforcements ready, were overwhelmed. Thousands were killed or captured, and many of the captured common soldiers were executed afterward. High-ranking nobles were held for ransom. Nicopolis became one of the last major disasters of medieval chivalry. It showed that courage and heavy armor could not compensate for a lack of coordination, poor planning, and an underestimation of an enemy who relied on layered defenses and strategic depth. Number 10. Jan Žižka. In the early 15th century, few European commanders rewrote the rules of warfare as dramatically as Jan Žižka, leader of the Hussite forces in Bohemia. His origins were humble, his military education was irregular, and yet he became one of the most effective commanders of the late medieval period, winning battles even after losing sight in one eye, and later after going completely blind. Žižka's greatest innovation was the war wagon, a heavy cart reinforced with shields and planks, fitted with firing ports for crossbows and early firearms, and protected by infantry with polearms and flails. When arranged in a circle or rectangle, the Wagenburget became a movable fortress. At battles like Sudomierz, 1420, and Witkov Hill, also 1420, heavily armored knights from the Holy Roman Empire believed they could simply charge these peasant rebels and smash them with overwhelming force. What actually happened was the opposite. At Sudomierz, Žižka positioned his wagons between ponds and marshes, creating a natural choke point. Cavalry had no room to maneuver. When they charged, they became trapped in the narrow causeway, where the wagons funneled them into predictable lanes. Hussite crossbowmen and handgunners fired from behind cover. Polearm infantry finished anyone who got too close. At Witkov Hill, Žižka defended a narrow ridge above Prague with only a few hundred men. Crusader knights attempted to scale the slope, but the steep terrain forced them into tight clusters. Hussite defenders used crossfire and downhill momentum to push them back. Many attackers fell from the cliffs or were forced into retreat. Žižka's brilliance lay in understanding something simple. A knight can't win if he can't reach you. The Hussites' success marked the rise of early gunpowder infantry and mobile defensive warfare. Knights who underestimated Žižka discovered that determination, engineering skill, and tactical creativity could outweigh armor, rank, and tradition.